Second Chances, Chapter 4.
Sergeant Major David Stevens was a happy man. After 30 years of service in the U.S. Army, it was time to retire. He and his dear wife, Phyllis, and the kids piled into their van and drove away from the life they had known for so long. An adventure lay before them, a new city, occupation, a new set of friends, a new life. As the family drove out the front gate of Fort Devens, a new dream began, onto Phoenix. Phyllis would be attending college, and they would then enjoy the blessings of retirement. Their 4 kids sat in the van quietly. This caused Phyllis to turn and ask what was wrong.
Just thinking,
Came the reply from the eldest. Susan was a contemplative individual anyway. Lisa was pouting as usual. But for the boys to be so quiet brought no little apprehension. She looked at the boys and asked why they were so quiet. Little Lee looked at his mom and said,
"We got a long way to go. And all our friends are here at Devens."
Rhett nodded his head in agreement. And so the mood was set for the first day. Mom played the part of navigator and directed David to the freeway. Heading west, they planned to stop at a McDonald's for lunch at about noon. After lunch, the kids became a little more active. That first day went well. The next day was a different story as the kids' ornery nature took hold, and the trip turned into a very loud nightmare. Driving through the Connecticut countryside, David was somewhat distracted. Suddenly, a cement truck on the wrong side of the freeway appeared before them, bearing down on the van at an unbelievable speed. David quickly assessed the situation. There was a considerable amount of traffic that morning. The lane to his left was full of bumper-to-bumper traffic. His own lane had the truck coming at him and to the rear bumper-to-bumper traffic as far as the mirror showed him. The only escape was to take to the shoulder. David swung left and hit the shoulder, slamming on the brakes. But the truck swung toward the shoulder as well. The van and the truck met head-on. David returned to consciousness in a small white room. A woman dressed in white stood over him.
"Mr. Stevens, how do you feel?"
David looked around. There was only the nurse and him. "Where is my family?" he asked quietly. The nurse straightened, said,
"Someone will be with you in a moment."
and left the room. A moment later, a police officer entered the room.
Sergeant Major, I have bad news for you. Your wife and children were killed in the accident.
It felt like David's heart stopped. Tears came to his eyes and ran hot down his face. David's life had just changed. The officer went on.
They died instantly. There could have been no pain.
Little comfort, little assurance. The nurse returned and found David sobbing uncontrollably. At this, she left and returned with a hypodermic. She injected David, saying,
"This will help you sleep."
David didn't want to sleep. He wanted to cry, to curse, to mourn his family. But the drug began to take effect, and he slept. Hours later, David returned to consciousness and realized the truth of his loss. The woman he had loved for 25 years and his kids were gone, and he was alone. The pain was excruciating. All the happy plans he and Phyllis had made were gone. No dreams, only loneliness would be his companion now. David had been on terminal leave when he left Fort Devens. So, as soon as he was able, he was transferred to the Army hospital at Fort Devens to mend his broken body. Many of his old friends came and visited. At first, he had visitors every day. But then, as time passed, their visits became farther apart until only his friend Tim O'Toole visited during the last couple of months. Then came the day of his discharge from the hospital. Again, Tim came to help him. He took him to the bachelor enlisted quarters, helped him take his duffel bag into his room, and told him to report to the headquarters company commander in the morning. The Army had a few options for him for the future. 800 hours. The next morning, David reported to the company commander. The Army did have a couple of options for him. He could go on and retire, stay in the service until he did decide to retire, or there was a special project looking for volunteers with his qualifications. A special project, something to try to help him through this time of extreme loneliness and pain. Nothing familiar to remind him of his loss. A time of challenge. After a short wait, he was refiling his security clearance paperwork. Briefings at the Post G2 office, then a trip to the Pentagon and more briefings by Army and Air Force security personnel. Then, a set of special orders assigned him to Nellis Air Force Base. In his briefings, he was told that this would be his official station. But he would have his duty station at the Groom Lake facility, Area 51. His project would be there at Area 51. The secrecy that surrounded Area 51 was intimidating. He underwent further security briefings and orientations. At last came the day to be briefed by the project director. Dr. Jeffrey Franklin was the director of Project Deep Silence. Whatever the project was, David knew that silence probably had little relevance to the work. Dr. Franklin was a tall, gangly man with white hair rather unkempt. David thought of Albert Einstein when looking at him. The good doctor strode in, introduced himself, and began talking.
Our project is one of greatest importance to medicine and space travel.
The doctor began.
It is a research project into suspended animation. We have successfully frozen and revived 100 rats, 20 rabbits, 3 sheep, 2 cows, and 1 horse. What do you think of that, my boy?
David wondered and then blurted out his question, how many of each have died in the attempts?
Well, my boy, you must remember this is a research project. We began by losing many rats. But when we successfully revived the rats, we lost only 20, then we lost only 1 rabbit and no sheep, cows, or horses. This is why I feel we are ready to freeze a man.
David assumed that he had been accepted into the project, otherwise, this man would not have told him so much, which, he had been told, was highly classified. The doctor looked at the sergeant major.
Well, my boy, are you ready to go?
David had only to grab his duffel bag, and he could sign out and go. Dr. Franklin led the volunteer out of the building to an Air Force staff car.
Back to my plane, if you would please, Jerry.
The driver replied.
Yes, sir.
And off they went. The drive to Andrews Air Force Base was short. The doctor was silent. David could only wonder how much of what the man had told him was true, especially about the deaths. Well, it was not as if he had a whole lot left to live for. His family was gone. Now, his military career had taken a new twist. It was, at least, interesting. As they arrived at Andrews, the doctor asked David about his education. David told him about his training and experience in electronics and cryogenics gained as a technician in many different aspects of communications and non-communications electronic emissions. The doctor simply nodded. He went on to tell the doctor about his other educational efforts. He had attended the Army's Sergeant's Major Academy, had a degree in military science, and a master's degree in theology. Again, the doctor only nodded. By then, they had arrived at a small jet aircraft. The driver brought the sedan to a stop at the plane's side. He got out, loaded David's duffel bag onto the airplane, left David and the doctor beside the plane, and moved the car off the tarmac. The doctor motioned David to board the plane and ascended the steps himself. A lovely Air Force sergeant seated the two, assured that their seat belts were secure, and informed the pilot that his passengers were aboard and secure. With that, the pilot began to taxi to the runway to take his place in line for departure. Franklin turned to David and told him they were headed directly for the Groom Lake facility. He would be quartered there, eat there, work there, and play there. For the next year, David could not go anywhere off Area 51. Once the craft was in the air, the doctor loosened his seat belt, turned to David, and told him everything he had ever wanted to know about Project Deep Silence. David listened for several hours as Dr. Franklin expounded on Project Deep Silence, cryogenics, cryogenic sleep, tests, notions, and procedures. David came to like Dr. Franklin. He was intelligent, exceptionally so. But it did not detract from his ability to relate to others. He explained deep, complex theoretical concepts in simple terms that nearly any Joe off the street could readily understand. In addition, Dr. Franklin had a ready smile, charisma, and an absolutely marvelous wit. The one thing that really struck with David was the test schedule. The first thing David would be subject to would be many mental, medical, and physical tests and examinations. Then, the first of the project tests would be limited to a 2-day cryogenic sleep. After which, there would be more medical, mental, and physical tests and examinations, plus a complete debriefing, which could take up to several days. The second of the project tests would have a duration of 7 days. More examinations, the tests of several weeks, a month, several months, then up to a full year. Then Dr. Franklin began asking David some rather odd questions, in this context at least.
David, my boy, if you could choose any subject in the whole world, what would you like to study? I want you to choose several subjects to study during our time with Project Deep Silence. Several academic subjects, several physical subjects, and several subjects of your personal choice.
Doctor, how long do I have to decide all these subjects?
You have all the time you need until we land at Groom Lake.
David sat for a time, considering his choices. Academic subjects? Well, he thought, electronic engineering, physics, and well, maybe higher mathematics. Would that do? Would it be challenging? Could he cut the mustard? Physical subjects. David wasn't even sure what the good doctor meant by physical subjects. Doctor, what did you mean by physical subject? Did you mean something like ditch digging, or did you mean something like boxing? A deep, hearty laugh came out of the doctor.
David, I meant something like karate or boxing or another physical skill.
Again, David sat for the remaining hours silently, considering the physical subject he would like to learn: karate, jiu-jitsu, taekwondo, kung fu, shavit, boxing. Well, all of these or any of these would be okay. As for the subjects of his choice, well, he had a master's in theology, and he would like to go for his PhD. David turned to Dr. Franklin. Well, doctor, I've decided. Whom do I tell what I have chosen for study?
My boy, you can tell me.
David told the doctor the choices he had made. Then, I asked him, do I have to prioritize these subjects?
No, my boy, you don't. We are going to provide you these subjects in video and audio media while you are in cryo sleep. So we will test you on a subject before you go in and after you come out, and we will see if you can learn while in cryo sleep.
Sergeant Stella Black walked back to see her two passengers. She smiled at David and asked if they would like a drink or a snack. David opened his mouth to reply when Dr. Franklin seemed to spit out a very curt reply.
Coffee, Black.
David was shocked. Dr. Franklin, for crying out loud, this is a human being. She is trying to make this flight pleasant, and you treat her like a slave? You had better apologize and answer with some courtesy. The doctor started.
Of course, how thoughtless of me. Please forgive me, my dear. May I have a cup of black coffee, please?
Stella was just as shocked as the doctor.
Yes, black coffee. And for you, Sergeant Major?
David smiled and asked for a cup of coffee as well. She returned a short while later and gave her passengers their coffee. She smiled at David.
I'll be back in a moment, Sergeant Major. Right after I give the men in the cockpit their coffee.
David watched her walk to the cockpit and disappear. Dr. Franklin looked up.
Quite an attractive young lady, don't you think, my boy?
She reappeared, sat next to David, and initiated a light conversation. Then, after a while, she returned to the cockpit, and David quietly rode out the remainder of the flight. Sergeant Black returned to the two men and instructed them to prepare for landing. After securing the seat belts, she returned to the cockpit, and the aircraft began its descent. The two men relaxed and allowed the aircraft crew to do their job. After the plane landed, David looked out the window to see if he could make out anything about the ultra-secret facility. But unfortunately, it was dark, and the only light he saw was the runway lights and a couple of buildings. The aircraft came to a stop, and that attractive sergeant opened the hatch and lowered the steps and announced that his staff car awaited him and the sergeant major. As David stepped by the sergeant, she smiled at him and wished him a good night. David mumbled a soft thank you. You have made this a very pleasant fight. Please thank the rest of the crew. The staff car driver took David to the senior BEQ and helped him with his duffel bag. David found that he had been registered, and the driver handed him his key. The two walked a few yards, and he stepped into his new home. He entered his quarters and fell into bed to sleep until noon.